You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining the American Revolution. This week, episode 316, Skirmishing Around Charleston. Last week, we saw the British leave Savannah, Georgia in July 1782, thus ending the British presence in that state. The war seemed to be wrapping up as peace negotiations continued in Europe. The British Southern Army under General Alexander Leslie, however, remained in Charleston, South Carolina. The Continental Army, under General Nathanael Greene, remained there to confront them. We last looked in on South Carolina in episode 304. The British Army was bottled up in Charleston, and the Patriot legislature met in Jacksonboro in early 1782, beginning to make decisions for how to restore civilian rule in the state. And while it appeared that major combat operations in South Carolina were at an end, both armies continued to probe the enemy lines for weaknesses and in search of forage. Soldiers on both sides continued to fight and die in small skirmishes. In February of 1782, Militia General Francis Marion had left his command to take a seat in the Jacksonboro Assembly. His second-in-command, Lieutenant Colonel Peter Ory, took command of Marion's brigade. After receiving reports of weaknesses in the enemy lines, Loyalist Colonel Benjamin Thompson assembled a force in Charleston to raid the Patriot militia. Thompson came from Massachusetts. Early in the war, a Patriot mob chased him from his home way back in 1774. He eventually took a commission under General Gage and formed the King's American Dragoons. In 1782, Thompson and his dragoons remained a part of the British defenses at Charleston. On February 19th, Thompson led his dragoons along with a company of British regular infantry. According to some accounts, Thompson was in search of deserters who had taken up the Patriot offer of amnesty and were now serving with the enemy. Thompson's brigade moved in force, several hundred men in 3 columns. They rode north of the city along the Cooper River. Near Strawberry Ferry, they captured an American lieutenant and 6 soldiers, as well as a sizable herd of cattle. Before the militia could react to the raid in force, the Loyalists withdrew back to their lines. 5 days later, however, the militia did strike back, attacking Thompson's Loyalists near Wamball Bridge, just outside of Charleston. The Patriots charged the bridge, which collapsed under their weight. Many of the men fell into the river along with their horses. Several drowned. The Patriot militia reported 10 killed and 8 wounded, while the British reported only 1 wounded. Around the same time, another force under Colonel Edward Barnwell attempted to confront a British foraging party south of Charleston that was collecting rice. As the Patriot militia rode near the Savannah River, Loyalist militia under Major Andrew DeVoe attacked them, killing 6 and capturing 5. Major DeVoe then took 3 small ships, which he used to seize and hold the town of Beaufort near the Georgia border for about 3 weeks. Finally, though, the Patriot militia managed to drive away DeVoe and his Loyalist militia. Some of the fighting around this time was more just violence by men who hated each other rather than anything that I think resembles actual warfare. In March, for example, a Patriot militia captain named Johnson, who had been captured by the British, was at home on parole and was out just hunting with a friend. The men came across Loyalist Colonel John Elrod and 2 other Loyalist soldiers who had evacuated Wilmington and were also returning home. Colonel Elrod took issue with the fact that Johnson was out hunting with his rifle. The terms of his parole forbade him from carrying a gun. The dispute turned ugly when Loyalists attacked and killed Johnson. They also attempted to kill Johnson's friend. However, he managed to knock away the rifle that was aimed at him, causing it to miss its target, and then fled the scene, managing to get to a neighbor and alert them of the murder. Now, the 3 Loyalists, having left this witness alive, also fled, fearing the local Patriot militia would come for them. And they were not wrong. Local Patriot militia Major Thomas Dugan raised a posse which found Elrod and one of the other loyalists in Elrod's home asleep at night. The other loyalist refused to admit that he was part of the murder, and another militia officer got a confession out of him by bashing his head repeatedly against the fireplace until the loyalist confessed. The militia then held a quick court-martial. At dawn, they rode both prisoners about a half-mile from the house, tied them to trees, and shot them. Events like this just didn't even seem to raise an eyebrow anymore. People were just so used to the fighting and killing. And while skirmishing continued throughout South Carolina, the real enemy for the Army once again was resources. General Greene wrote repeatedly that he did not have enough food to feed his men. When he did have some food, it was often so rancid that it was not fit for human consumption. Eating poor food or too little food contributed to the disease and deaths that soldiers faced during the spring and summer of 1782. Neither the Continental Congress, nor the state of South Carolina, nor anyone else for that matter, seemed willing to assist the Army. In April, General Greene wrote to one of his officers that his men had been without even rice for 3 days and that their hunger was putting them in a, quote, mutinous mood. Certainly seems understandable that if you're not being fed as you continue to fight for your country, that might make you a bit disagreeable. And food was not the only problem. Clothing also reached crisis proportions. When Captain Walter Finney arrived at the main Continental camp in April, he noted that the troops were, quote, badly fed and wretchedly clothed. He noted that about 1/3 of the men were completely naked, having only a hat. They had tied blankets around their naked bodies to defend against the weather and, quote, preserve decency. General Greene used his personal credit to contract with a local vendor, John Banks and Company, to provide 30,000 pounds worth of clothing for his soldiers. That company ended up going bankrupt before providing what it promised, and General Greene was left on the hook to repay the debt to the company's creditors. These continuing shortages resulted in grumblings that could easily have turned into another mutiny. The Pennsylvania line, which had famously mutinied just a year earlier, was at this point the largest force under Greene's command. In March, Greene ordered a Maryland officer to select a force of officers and men for a raid on the enemy. When that officer selected units from the Pennsylvania line to serve under him for the raid, the Pennsylvanians balked at the orders and protested it was an infringement of their rights. They did not want to have a Maryland officer with the authority to choose to send them into battle. Greene's response was that they were all in the Continental Army and that the Army was not a civilian organization where you get to decide which superior officers can give you orders. The soldiers continued to grumble, but Greene's firm hand forced them to comply. Around this same time, the British sent pamphlets into the American camps noting that deserters would be fed, clothed, and given money that their own army was denying to them. Several men from the Pennsylvania line took up the British on their offer and deserted. Going without food, clothing, and pay from an ungrateful country had become too much for some of the men. Greene offered reward money for anyone who provided information on who was spreading these incitements to mutiny and desertion. A camp follower turned in Sergeant George Gosnell of the Pennsylvania line. Gosnell had come to America years earlier as a British regular. He had deserted and joined the Continentals while the Pennsylvania line was still up north. He had been identified as one of the leaders of the mutiny of the Pennsylvania line a year earlier when they were still up in New Jersey. Apparently, Sergeant Gosnell continued to gripe and was accused of encouraging another mutiny among the Pennsylvania line here in South Carolina. Now, the mutiny in 1781 had been settled rather peacefully. Greene, however, was not willing to let another mutiny take place again. Gosnell had to be made an example. Greene ordered Gosnell to be put under arrest and to be held for trial by another part of the army. The following day, an assembled court-martial tried Gosnell, found him guilty, and sentenced him to death. Greene approved the execution for the following day and ordered that 100 men from each brigade be turned out to witness the execution. Several others who were suspected of mutinous talk were also investigated. Richard Peters of the Maryland line, as well as 4 more soldiers from the Pennsylvania line, all of whom, by the way, were British deserters, were suspected of fomenting mutiny, but these men were simply dismissed from service and forced to leave the state. It's unclear, there may not have been enough proof to try and prosecute them, but there was another issue as well. Greene later wrote to President John Hanson that hanging Gosnell had made clear to the rest of the army that they really shouldn't put him to the test, but that he was banishing the others rather than executing them because he felt executing all of them would really harm overall morale. There were still a few desertions following the execution, but by May, rumors began to arrive that the British were planning to evacuate the South. This seemed to put a stop to soldiers thinking about going over to the enemy. The rumors, however, raised a concern for Greene that Congress would be even less inclined to provide the promised food, clothing, and supplies that his army so desperately needed. Greene was still concerned that the British might abandon Savannah in order to reinforce Charleston and go on the offensive once again. On May 20th, British General Leslie sent Captain Francis Skelly as a messenger to Greene's camp. The captain carried a copy of Parliament's resolution of February 12th, ending offensive operations in America. And Greene met with Captain Skelly, who also informed the general that the British commander-in-chief in North America, General Clinton, had been recalled, and that General Guy Carleton was the new commander. The two men talked about a lot of things, but at this time, even General Leslie was not aware of orders from London that he was to evacuate all British troops from Savannah, Charleston, and New York. Carleton had come over with those orders, but had not distributed them yet. Despite the fact that it hadn't reached them yet, it did seem clear to all that Britain's efforts were coming to an end. To that end, Skelly passed along Leslie's proposal to Greene that the two armies simply agree to a ceasefire. Greene balked at this idea for several reasons. To start with, he didn't entirely trust the British. They could just be trying to buy time until they received reinforcements. Further, even if the British were being honest, any agreed ceasefire might be seen as agreeing to a separate peace without the agreement of France. This could just be a British effort to drive a wedge between France and America and to gain an advantage at the peace negotiations. The result was that Greene agreed to do nothing. He passed along the proposal to the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, along with his comments about how he would comply with whatever Congress wanted, but that he could not see how they could agree to this without France's approval. You've got to remember, when France first entered into this alliance, the fear of French diplomats was that the colonies would come to terms with Britain and allow Britain to turn its full and undivided wrath against France. The Americans had assured France that this would not happen, and so that's why Greene was so concerned about getting France's approval for even a ceasefire. Even after Savannah evacuated in July, Greene remained vigilant. He was concerned that thousands of enemy soldiers leaving Savannah would simply sail up to Charleston to provide for a new British offensive. So Greene remained very much on alert and even called for General Wayne's small force in Georgia to join him in South Carolina as quickly as possible. The result of all this was that there would be continuing attacks and skirmishes back and forth between the two sides, primarily on foraging parties. The Continentals simply would not stop until the British left the state. Now, in early July, before the British evacuated Savannah, Greene already ordered his army to take a new position closer to Charleston. The Continentals moved about 7 miles to the south to the Ashley Hill Plantation, which was only a few miles from the British lines at Charleston. Greene reported that he selected the location closer to the enemy to put more pressure on them, but also that it was good high ground that was dry and would be healthy for the army. Now, on that second point, he was just wrong. Within 3 days in the new location, soldiers began falling ill with terrible fevers. Within 2 weeks, more than half the army was incapacitated with illness. Over the summer and fall, hundreds of soldiers died. General Greene and General Wayne both became bedridden. Malaria ravaged the army as mosquitoes spread the disease without mercy or pause throughout the camp. Once it happened, Greene considered moving, but continuing rumors of an imminent British evacuation convinced him to keep his army in place. General William Moultrie, who had been taken prisoner back in 1780 when Charleston fell, had been exchanged, and he visited the army in September. He noted that before he even reached the camp, the smell of all the dead bodies overwhelmed him. Greene ordered that the army put a stop to beating out a march at funerals, since they had become so common that they only contributed to the depression of those who were still in their sickbeds. Over those brutal summer months, malaria simply decimated the Continental Army. Now, despite the devastating impact of malaria, the Continentals remain active in their efforts to defend against any actions by the British or Loyalists in Charleston. The key officer tasked with keeping tabs on the British was Lieutenant Colonel John Lawrence. Greene had given Lawrence command of the Continental Cavalry that Light Horse Harry Lee had led before he had returned to Virginia. Lawrence kept his horsemen camped between the main Continental lines and the British lines, where his cavalry could take on any British foraging parties or anyone else who tried to come out from behind those lines. The British had maintained a small galley with about 40 men on the Ashley River. The crew of this galley regularly conducted raids on plantations along the river, seeking plunder and intelligence. So one of the things Lawrence did around this time was to organize a task force to attack that galley at night, and it was quite successful. The Continentals managed to scuttle the ship and take prisoner most of the crew. Now, despite this success, Lawrence was getting more and more frustrated with his command. The enemy was remaining quiet in Charleston, and Lawrence was spending most of his time arguing with locals when his men tried to commandeer food or other necessities. While Lawrence had initially commanded all of the light infantry, in June, Greene gave command of the light infantry to General Mordecai Gist, an officer from Maryland. He gave command of the cavalry to Lieutenant Colonel George Baylor from Virginia. So at that point, Lawrence was essentially demoted and took a much more limited role in command only of Lee's old legion. And even among that legion, Lawrence was not particularly popular. They saw this South Carolina officer who was put in command of them as a young kid who had no cavalry experience. His father, of course, was Henry Lawrence, who had been president of the Continental Congress and was currently working as part of the diplomatic team in France negotiating peace. But as such, many of the men saw Lawrence as getting some job based on politics and connections rather than any military merit. Around the same time, Lawrence's good friend, Alexander Hamilton, wrote to him suggesting that he give up his field command and join Hamilton in Philadelphia as a delegate to the Continental Congress. Lawrence declined. Despite his frustrations, he wanted to be a successful field commander. A part of Lawrence's duty was to obtain intelligence on the enemy. Having lived in Charleston for many years before the war, Lawrence was well positioned to renew contacts with his old friends still in those Loyalist communities in Charleston. Many of these Loyalists were eager to receive pardons so that they could remain in South Carolina after the war, and were more than willing to provide Lawrence with whatever intelligence they could. In late August, Lawrence learned that the British were planning a large foraging expedition with about 500 men and more than a dozen ships. General Greene, on receiving this information, ordered General Gist to attack the enemy foraging party. Lawrence at this time was actually also laid up with malaria, but he ended up leaving his sickbed to participate in the fight. Gist planned to move his Continentals into place at night. The following morning, August 27th, he would launch a surprise attack on the foraging party. Gist believed he could force the enemy to retreat back to their boats on the Combahee River. He would then use a field howitzer to fire on those ships. Gist ordered Lawrence to take a command of a 50-man force that was defending the howitzer. Gist believed that the British would launch a land assault on the howitzer as the only way to protect their ships. Lawrence's job was to keep off that assault force. Just before sunrise, Gist's Continentals stormed the field, only to find the field empty. The British had received a tip about the attack and had reboarded their ships around midnight and sailed away. Now, at this point, Gist realized that if the enemy knew about the attack, they probably also knew about the howitzer that was being set up downriver. He sent a messenger galloping off to warn Lawrence and followed quickly behind with about 150 soldiers. It was already too late. The British had deployed a force to ambush Lawrence's detachment as they moved into position earlier that night. Lawrence found himself outnumbered 3-1. With few options, he led a bayonet charge directly at the enemy, hoping that the attack would surprise them and force a panic. Instead, the experienced enemy fired a volley into the attacking Continentals, killing or injuring many of them, and forcing the rest to flee into the night. When Gist's relief force arrived, he found only the retreating British boarding their ships with the captured howitzer. Gist's men looked over the battlefield for casualties, and among the dead was Colonel Lawrence, shot through the heart and killed instantly. The skirmishing continued around Charleston as both sides waited for an end to the war that never seemed to come. And next week, we're going to head over to Paris to look in on those negotiations and try to figure out why the end never seemed to come. Hey, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show, part of the Airwave Media Network. Thanks to my Patreon supporters in the Alexander Hamilton Club, George Davis, Mike Hager, John Salentano, Michael Mulhern, and the Sons of the American Revolution. The SAR was kind enough to provide me with 6 months of support at the Hamilton Club level, which is coming to an end in a few weeks. Before it does, I wanted to let everyone know that getting involved in your local SAR chapter, or DAR if you're a woman, is a great way to get involved with others who care about this important era. You can reach out to your state chapter to get more details on how to join. There are lots of great 250th events coming up over the next few years, so this is really a particularly good time to join. Even if you don't plan to join, you can find out a great deal about the Revolutionary War events in your area. Go to sar.org for more details. I also want to thank Robert Morris Circle supporters Joe Kelsey, Patrick LeBeau, and Kurt Avard. I also appreciate Ken Canestrini and Theo Speedy for generous one-time gifts via PayPal or Venmo. I really do appreciate everyone who helps to support this podcast. This podcast simply would not be able to continue without your generosity, so thank you very much. Finally, I just want to mention a bit of housekeeping. I switched my primary podcast feed from Podbean to Megaphone last year. I, however, kept my Podbean account open, and I still see a few thousand downloads coming from there. That feed is going away in the next few weeks, so if you suddenly stop seeing episodes or your podcast disappears altogether, it may be that you're still mistakenly using that feed. Now, supposedly, once I close that account, Podbean should still pull my episodes from somewhere else, so you actually can still use the Podbean app to listen to the podcast. But I just wanted to put out this warning in case things don't work out as expected. That may be the reason. Now, this week, we covered the continuing standoff in South Carolina. I mentioned in passing during the main episode a 30,000-pound debt that General Greene had personally guaranteed to help clothe his army. Like most officers, Greene expected that the Continental Congress would help to cover the cost of this expense. Congress did not. The debt would follow Greene through the rest of his life and would even follow his widow, Katie Greene, after his death. The cost of keeping the war going until the very end was something that many officers like Greene just had to cover on their own, and which a rather ungrateful Congress never made good on. The result was that the Southern Army, much like the Northern Army, felt largely abandoned by their country. They wanted to go home, but the war just seemed to drag on. Now, of course, events always moved painfully slow in the 18th century compared to today. It would take more than 2 years after the surrender of Yorktown until we reach a final peace between Britain and the United States. And during this period, many men continued to die for their country. Of course, John Lawrence is a tragic example of this. Lawrence was one of the very few officers who had been part of George Washington's inner circle. He had been best friends with Alexander Hamilton and the Marquis de Lafayette during that time. Lawrence's family wealth and power would have made him a political force in the new country had he lived. By 1782, Lafayette had returned to France, and Hamilton had left the army for Congress. Lawrence, who had already been on one diplomatic mission and had also served in the South Carolina legislature, could easily have left military service with honor and begun a political career. His decision to continue on the front lines until the very end was a noble but ultimately fatal decision. Lawrence, had he lived, could have really become an important figure in the U.S. He seemed to be a Federalist, which was uncommon in the South after the war, and even more uncommon, he was an abolitionist from South Carolina. It really would have been interesting to see how he coped with the great political conflicts after the war and how he might have shaped them. Of course, we'll never know. His father, Henry Lawrence, was devastated by the loss of his son. The elder Lawrence had been in Paris negotiating the final peace with Britain, and although he saw the negotiations through to completion, he retired from public life after the war. He declined opportunities to serve in Congress, to serve on the Constitutional Convention, or even serve in the State Assembly. The only thing he ever did do publicly was in 1788, he attended the state convention that ratified the U.S. Constitution. The men who we seem to remember and really make history tend to be the ones who actually lived through the war and go on to bigger and better things afterwards. Lawrence, of course, showed great promise, but of course he would never have that opportunity. My book recommendation this week is called The Last Man to Die in the American Revolution, The Triumph and Tragedy of John Lawrence, by Harlow Giles Unger. Now, the title's not entirely accurate. Of course, there would be more deaths after that of Colonel Lawrence, but Lawrence probably was one of the last very well-known and more prominent officers to die in this war. This book is a newer biography, just released in 2023. It's relatively short, but gives a good account of John Lawrence's life. The author, Unger, has written a great many books from the Revolutionary War era. He's still actively writing, despite the fact that he will be 93 later this year. So if you do want to read more about John Lawrence, which a lot of folks don't know a lot about, check out The Last Man to Die in the American Revolution. My online recommendation this week is revolutionarywar.us. Now, you may note that I cover quite a few minor skirmishes in recent episodes especially. Revolutionarywar.us is doing a phenomenal job of listing and summarizing many of these smaller skirmishes that don't have much else written about them. So if you're looking for information on some of the smaller or more obscure skirmishes, this site is a great resource. They also do a bunch of other things, biographies of important people and lots of other stuff. If you want to read more about it, just go to their website, revolutionarywar.us. My question this week asks, what was the largest warship in the American Revolution? Well, the question doesn't make clear which army we're talking about, so I'll go through all three very briefly. The Continentals never had very large ships. They could not produce one. The largest ship that was actually built by the Continental Navy had only 32 guns, which would have made it a lower-end fifth-rate ship in the British Navy. I think there were about 5 ships that reached this class, including the Hancock and the Washington. But there was also the Bonhomme Richard, which John Paul Jones commanded. That one had 40 guns, so it was larger than all these other ships. That ship was gifted by the French for use by the Americans. And I think this was the largest American ship that the Continental Navy put into use during the war. Again, it wouldn't even come close to being a fourth-rate ship in the British Navy, but that was as big as we got. Now, the Continentals did hope to build a larger ship. The Congress commissioned 3 ships of the line, but only one of them was ever built, the 74-gun America, and that would be completed in late 1782. Now, a few months before it was actually completed, Congress just gave the ship to France. France had lost a similar ship in Boston Harbor around that time, and the Americans really couldn't afford to keep such a large ship anyway. After the Treaty of Paris, the Continentals sold off all of their ships and discharged the entire Continental Navy. The ship, America, never really went into use, even in the French Navy. A few years after acquiring it, the French noted that the shoddy construction had led to dry rot throughout the ship. They decided it wasn't worth rehabbing, and they simply scrapped it. Now, I think the largest ship in the British Navy at this time was the Royal George. That was a 100-gun ship built during the 7 Years' War. The Royal George remained fairly close to England during the war, seeing combat at the Battle of Cape St. Vincent in 1780. This one had a crew of about 900 men, and while it survived several battles, it sank in 1782, simply while it was undergoing repair in Spithead. At that time, more than half of her crew drowned without an enemy ship anywhere near in sight. It also killed 300 women and 60 children who were visiting aboard the ship at the time. It's believed that the ship was heeled over too far, and it caused water to enter through the lower tier of gun ports, which caused the ship apparently to sink very quickly. Now, even larger than the Royal George was the French Ville de Paris. This one had over 100 cannons. By some measures, it was 104. I've seen some that said it had 110 or 115, and it had a crew of over 1,000 officers and men. It was launched just after the 7 Years' War ended. It was Admiral de Grasse's flagship during Yorktown. Now, the British captured it in 1782 at the Battle of the Saints, which we covered a few weeks ago. That ship remained in British control for a few months, and then it was being taken back to Britain, but never made it as it sank in a hurricane. So the largest ships of all three armies saw their end outside of combat. The America, as I said, was just considered defective and decommissioned. The Royal George sank in a freak accident during repairs, and the Ville de Paris sank in a storm. Of course, the age of sail was going to come to an end a few decades later, around the time of the U.S. Civil War. Metal ships began to replace wooden ones, and steam power replaced sails. Before these changes, some of the really largest sailing ships were built. This was, of course, long after the American Revolution ended. Some of these really big ships, like the Victoria, carried 130, 140 guns. Such large ships, however, rarely proved useful. The U.S. Navy, after it got rebuilt many years after the war ended, built the USS Pennsylvania, which was the largest sailing ship ever built for the U.S. Navy. The USS Pennsylvania actually only sailed one time, from Delaware Bay to Norfolk Navy Yard. It sat there for more than 2 decades, and then was burned by her own crew in 1861 in order to prevent her capture by the Confederacy. So large ships does not necessarily mean effective ships. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, please reach out to me either via email or on Twitter, Facebook, Quora, or Reddit. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.